This is my absolutely all-time favorite loom knitted sock pattern. It's just a good basic sock in a classic design with short road heels and toes. There are two secrets to the wonderfulness of these socks. One is choosing the right yarn, and one is getting the perfect fit. Real sock yarn is quite important to getting great socks. These are two of my favorites. Both of these are German yarns designed for hand knitters, and they're rather expensive. I think they're worth it, and the socks last for years. They are made from superwash wool with a small amount of a stretchy fiber added. It may be listed as nylon, polyamide, or even lycra. This combination is long-wearing, washable, comfortable for most people, and keeps its shape well. But it may be too expensive to be practical, especially for new knitters who are just learning. So here's an alternative, and this is what I'm knitting with today. Mary Maxim and sometimes Hirschner's also produce sock yarns that fit similar parameters. They have worked very well for me. And here's another one. This is Drops Fable. I have not personally used it yet, but it has been highly recommended to me by fellow sock knitters who are quite expert. So I have some on order, and I'll give you my opinion once I've tried it out. Now, let's measure for the socks. This is the fit part, and it's super important. Measure around the circumference of your foot with a cloth tape so it hugs properly, and subtract 1/2 inch, and that will be our target measurement. The pattern is based on getting 8 stitches per inch on the loom. I'm getting that today on a Cindy Wood 3/16 inch gauge sock loom. This is the universal loom, so I can adjust it to fit anybody. I quite consistently get 8 stitches per inch on other extra fine gauge looms also. Subtracting that 1/2 inch is creating what we call negative ease, meaning the circumference of the sock is smaller than the foot it will fit. And I use less negative ease than some people for a couple of reasons. Here's one of them. If we have enough negative ease that the sock fabric is doing this business of stretching out, the stitches are showing that they're stretched on the top of my foot, but I will also feel them under my heel, and I don't care for the feeling at all. The second reason is that as time goes on and you wash the socks, and they are washable, the fabric tends to draw in a little bit more beyond your initial gauge, even if you did wash and dry your swatch. So you end up with more than the 1/2 inch negative ease that was measured to start with. So working with the true measurement minus 1/2 inch produces socks that, for me, wear comfortably for the entire life of the sock fabric, which is considerable. The sock pattern in this video is also available for free on my website in written form, and you're looking at paragraph 1. So swatch to make sure that you're getting 8 stitches per inch, and also check the row gauge, although we're going to check the row gauge again as we move along because it's super important and a small swatch doesn't entirely determine it. For this pattern, for the video and the written one on my website, I've done all the math that I possibly can for you. But if you are really averse to doing any arithmetic, you might enjoy Socks of All Sorts for Knitting Looms, my book on Ravelry. It contains instructions for multiple styles and gauges of socks, from infants through extra-large adults. In this video today, we're just addressing adult socks, from small women to large men. And the book is full of charts with all the math done for you. It's just not possible to cover the number of variables we have in a single video using all sizes and gauges. Back to choosing your size. Pick the number that will be the circumference of the sock, that is your real measurement minus 1/2 inch, from this list, and use the number of pegs shown for that size. I'm using 64. All of the numbers are multiples of 4 because that works out best for creating a heel using the method I use. For this pattern, use the U-wrap stitch. This may look to you like the flat stitch, but watch closely. My yarn supply is coming from the left and is loose. I'm controlling it with my left thumb, and every time I start to hook over, I lift my thumb, which allows the stitch being created by the hook in a big up and over the peg movement to use the previous stitch to wrap the yarn around the peg. I know that many people are accustomed to making the U-wrap by literally taking the yarn supply and wrapping it around the peg. With the number of stitches involved in a sock, this would be crazy making for me. But my method works very well, getting a stitch that is not overly tight. By the way, it doesn't really matter which direction you work around the loom. Most right-handers will prefer clockwise, as I am doing. Most left-handers will prefer the opposite, but it's not terribly important. Do what works for you. All adjustable looms will have something like this, a little piece that goes across so that you can adjust the number of stitches. And it can be a little bit tricky to learn to knit it. The secret is angling your hook down into the stitches from above, and you'll get it with practice. The second biggest challenge is going around the narrow end on a loom such as this one. It does take a little practice to make sure the stitches are even as compared to the ones that are going down the straight edge. I suggest you relax your hands rather than tense them while trying to learn to do this. It's instinctive to tense up, but it makes matters worse. Practice is what makes things better. On Cindy wood looms, this is how we adjust the number of pegs that we're going to use. Slide the wedge into the position that allows for the right stitch count. Then tighten it back down. Other looms have similar systems. On this loom, the cast-on that I liked the best for finished effect was the double E-wrap. Wrap twice around the peg, lift the lower wrap over the upper wrap, snug it up, but not so much it will be difficult to knit off on the coming row, and repeat all the way around the loom. For some reason that I don't really understand, I really am more comfortable working my cast-on counterclockwise and then switching directions for the knitting. That doesn't really cause any problems at all. To summarize where we are right now, you have selected a size, adjusted the loom for that size, assuming your loom is adjustable, and cast on the correct number of stitches. There's the completed cast on, and now I'm ready to start knitting in my clockwise direction. For these socks, I'm using Knit 2, Purl 2 ribbing. You may actually use any kind of ribbing that you like, or no ribbing at all. Instead of ribbing, you could knit 30 rows of plain stockinette, then lift the cast on and hang it on the same pegs in order to get a hung hem. You may use any length of ribbing that you want, but I suggest that it be at least 15 rows. The stitches on the wedge will again be the most challenging to purl, but angle is everything. Experiment until you find the angle that allows you access. The Knit 2 Purl 2 ribbing used on the sample will work fine for any size that I've given you in this pattern because I gave you all multiples of 4. Just be aware that if you use a different pattern and the sizes are not all multiples of 4, you might need to use Knit 1 Purl 1 ribbing. When the desired length of ribbing has been accomplished, simply continue knitting in the round using all knit stitches. Now, while I knit, I'd like to talk for a moment about the speed of knitting. I can also hand knit socks on needles, and people ask me frequently, is knitting socks on a loom faster than knitting socks by hand? And the answer is no, not for me. And I gather not for most loom knitters. That's not the reason I knit them at all. If you have a sock emergency, nowadays we have Walmart, I suggest we hustle on down there and get some real quick. Knitting them by hand, whether on needles or on a loom, is because you want to do it for fun, as a creative way to pass the time. When I choose the loom over needles, it's because I'm less prone to repetitive strain syndrome when loom knitting. As you knit, make a note of every round knitted. I use the note-taking app on my phone. It's also a good idea to add a yarn marker to the fabric every 10 rows. Doing so will enable us to know what the row gauge is much more perfectly than a swatch makes possible. My real yarn markers are there but did not show well in the picture, so I put some artistic ones in there to show you what I mean. The marker is just a contrasting piece of yarn slid through a stitch. It's not really knitted in. Here's how to use that information. If 40 rows equals 4 inches, obviously you have 10 stitches per row, but it's just as easy if 40 rows equals 3 inches. Using our calculator, take the 40 rows, divide them by the 3 inches, and that tells us we have 13.33333 stitches per inch, which is what I actually got. So that's our row gauge, and say I want 6 inches of sock top. It comes out 79.99998. I would want 80 rows. But say I already knitted 15 rows of ribbing, which I did. That means in terms of rounds of plain knitting, I only need 65. So when there's as much sock top as you want, it's time to knit the heel. Since the sample is 64 pegs, we'll go from stitch 1 to stitch 32 for the heel. Here are the peg counts for the other sizes. Also, here is given the length of the shortest row when we short row in. For the heel, we'll knit back and forth, starting in the same direction we've been going. And I do this slightly differently than some other knitters do. I knit the entire half of the pegs for the first row. That's stitches 1 through 32. Some knitters immediately start a short row and make it 31. It's a minor difference, but I like the way it comes out doing it my way. The arrow is pointing to the 32nd stitch. It has been knitted, and you see the yarn tail coming off. The yarn is coming off the final peg, which is there. And now we're going to take the working yarn and wrap it around the next peg over. That wrap won't get knitted off until we resume knitting in the round. However, its presence will prevent the formation of a hole where the heel joins the remainder of the sock. Now we'll knit back to the right. When we do, I'll knit all the way back to what was stitch 2 on the first heel row. Stitch 1 is on the white peg. For my second sock, in order to make Kitchenering it off simpler, I moved the first stitch over to be centered on the end. But the principle is the same every time. We knitted 32 stitches on the row going to the left. We knit 1 fewer on the row going to the right. We will wrap peg 1 before returning to knitting to the left. Here I've knitted over to peg 31. Last time we knitted to 32, but we will wrap 32 and not knit it, and then knit back to the right. Yet again, the row gets 1 peg shorter. The last stitch has a brown strand on it. We'll wrap the next peg over and knit back to the left. This is the first stitch of the new row. We repeat the process over and over, knitting 1 stitch fewer every row, then wrapping the peg that is next to that final stitch. Repeat this short rowing in process until the shortest row for your size has been achieved. Here are the numbers for each size shortest row again, and the heel pouch will begin to form visibly inside the loom. I've just knitted my shortest row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We'll wrap the next peg and knit back to the right. The shortest row in this case was knitted from right to left, so there's the working yarn. We'll knit these pegs, but then also this peg. It has 2 wraps on it, and both of them should be knitted over on this row. I've just done that. So this peg, both loops were knitted off, and you can sort of see that in there. I find it makes a smoother heel shape if I do not knit this one again immediately. In all future rows, it will be knitted, but for this very next time, since it was just knitted over, we'll slip it. That means don't wrap it, don't knit it, and knit on over this way and include the next peg that has 2 wraps on it. I just did that. This is the newly knitted peg. It has 2 wraps knitted off, and sometimes they make themselves obvious inside there. So as before and on every future row, this most recently added back peg will slip it the first time, then knit all the way across and include the next peg that has 2 wraps on it. It's right there. And knit them both over. And we'll keep repeating this process to and fro until all of the stitches for the heel half of the sock are back in work. Here's the second sock. Peg number 1 is marked with the safety pin. I've just finished the final row of the heel. So this was the last stitch knitted. Now I'll wrap the next peg over in the same manner as we did the very first time on row 1 of the heel. That rule is the same wherever you choose to place stitch number 1. Resume knitting in a circular manner and begin with stitch number 1. And now we're going to start knitting down the length of the foot between the heel and the toe, which is the point at which it becomes really important to keep track of your rows. The reason the row count needs to be so accurate is that because down the length of a foot in a women's size, 1/4 inch makes a whole size, not a half size of difference. These socks need to be 8 7/8 inches long. So let's first turn 7/8 into a decimal like this. Expressed as a decimal, that's 8.875 for the length of our sock, times whatever the row gauge is. And here, this result is 118 rows. You can't knit 0.33 rows, so you have to round up or down, and I've decided on 118. The heel and the toe contribute some to the length of the sock. Half of the rows in each of the heel and the toe go under the foot or down the length of the foot. But the exact number for each size that the heel and toe contribute is in the chart. Therefore, to get the correct foot length, we take the total rows required and subtract the number that the heel and toe have contributed. For this sock, 74 foot rows are needed. The dotted line represents the distance that we'll be knitting. In this case, 74 rows, but your number will be unique. And although I often use the word rows, understand that in fact they are complete rounds. When the foot rounds are complete, knit the toe exactly as you knitted the heel. Often people have trouble visualizing that the two are so similar, but they really are. And with the heel posed as it is here, you can sort of visualize that. The short rowing process will create the underside of the toe first, then the top side, and we'll finish up by Kitchener stitching the top of the toe to the remainder of the foot. One method of Kitchenering that I've used in the past involves knitting several rows of waste yarn in a contrasting color after the completion of the toe knitting. The purple is my contrasting yarn here. I have videos on that I will link you in the program notes. But it turns out that on this loom, I didn't care for the method. I believe it's because the row count is quite dense per inch, 13.3. And that makes those stitches hard to Kitchener into once off the loom. But I really like the fabric so well that I decided not to try to alter that, but to find another method that I liked for Kitchenering off, and here it comes. For this particular loom, I have found it most convenient for me to do the Kitchener stitch right from the loom. Last time I used this as peg number 1, which is logical, but in order to get the sock more symmetrically on the loom, I used this marked peg where the safety pin is. as number 1. My last stitch was the one next to the safety pin. That's where the yarn is emerging from. I also wrapped 5 times around the loom to make sure I would have enough yarn. I really made it in 4 last time, but just to be safe. So I'm going to go into, from the purl side, stitch number 1, and lift it off. And pull all that length of yarn through. You just have to be patient with this. At this point, I'm not pulling anything tight. Now we need to go into the knit side, which is below the stitch to the last stitch that was knitted. That's the last peg where the yarn emerged from. So we'll go in from the knit side and lift it off of its peg. Now across the loom, which is really across the sock toe, we go into a stitch that's been previously knitted in from the purl side, and we go in from the knit side to start the next Kitchener stitch. So that one's already off, and I find the knit side by looking at what will be the outside of the sock. So I'm peering down inside the loom, go into that, from the next stitch across, go into the purl side and lift. I get to the purl side by going down from the top, and next time I come across, I'll go in from there. That's a good view of the knit side. Make sure that the yarn doesn't hang up. Find the stitch on this side that I previously lifted off. So each time we first go into a stitch that we've already worked once, and we go in from the knit side, and it can take a little patience to locate. We then move 1 stitch over and enter that stitch from the purl side and lift that stitch off of the peg, and patiently pull the long yarn tail through to avoid tangles. I'm going to alternate around, lifting off a new stitch, going into the previous stitch. This is why you don't pull your yarn too tight. I wouldn't be able to see the previous stitch if I did, because I have to go in through the knit side of it. There it is. The ends are tricky. It will get considerably easier as we move down the parallel sides of the loom. Now lift off a new stitch, going in from the purl side, stamp from the top. Of course, you may use 2 needles to take off the working Kitchener if you prefer. The Kitchenering method is a personal choice. Previous stitch on the knit side. New stitch on the purl side. And from this point, it starts to get easier. Working down the parallel sides makes the previous stitch a little bit easier to spot. And we keep on alternating from side to side. Always keep in mind, each stitch actually gets worked into twice. Once from the knit side, once from the purl side. And that's how we create what looks exactly like a row of knitting, but we're working it in a completely different way to join the top of the toe. While you work, do not over tighten that long strand of yarn that's making the stitches. Doing so will simply make it more difficult to locate the stitch that you need to work into. The row of knitting is progressing. You can see it now crossing the center of the loom. So let's go to the end of the process. It continues just like this. I'm now approaching the opposite end of the top of the sock, and I have a long line of manually created knitting. And I'm going in as I have been from the knit side of the previous stitch and then the purl side of a new stitch and lifting it off. By the way, it turned out that really 4 times around this loom would have been plenty. I didn't want to run out of yarn with you watching, but it turns out that having rotated around so that my end stitch was right in the center of the end of the loom saved quite a lot of yarn over the time I did it previously, starting with the white peg as peg number 1. I also found it easier to keep track of where I was and to avoid tangles, so I do kind of recommend starting in the middle of one end if you're using a loom shaped like this one. And here come the very last stitches. By the way, once I found out I had way more than enough yarn, I shortened the yarn tail to make life easier. Now, once we go through that last stitch, we can remove the sock from the loom. The toe has been stretched around the loom, so it's going to look a lot better and its stitches will seem more normal if we give it a lengthwise tug, then a widthwise tug, then another lengthwise tug. Now it's just a matter of tightening up our row of Kitchener stitching. It is so tempting to try to pull on one end and hope that it will tighten itself up, but I haven't found that to be effective. I find it far better and more reliable and less problematic to pull one stitch at a time, and the loop that you pull up gets longer and longer as you pull. The difference between a great looking Kitchener stitch, and great looking means you really can't tell it's been done, and one that is not so lovely, is the tension at which you manage to pull the row. It needs to emulate as closely as possible the size of the other knitted stitches. I started out tightening the stitches by pulling up with the yarn needle, the same yarn needle that I used to do the stitching. It was a little bit awkward. My needle is quite small to fit those tiny stitches, and now I really don't need it to be that small, so I switched to the regular loom pick, which has a nice blunt end and better mechanical advantage, and found it to be easier on my hands to tighten up the Kitchener row using the loom pick. So let's real quick finish tightening up this row. It'd be kind of fun if we were really this fast, but of course nobody is. And as I said before, speed is not the issue here. Great socks, great fit, a good way to pass the time creatively. Those are the issues. But here we are at the end. Once this is pulled through, weave in the yarn tail using whatever method you like the best. Just remember, you don't want lumps and bumps in the toe. That will be very uncomfortable. And neither do you want the yarn tail to pop out and unravel all your beautiful Kitchenering. I recommend washing the socks in warm water before wearing them. That will do 3 things. It will smooth out any slight bumpiness in the fabric, get rid of any sizing that might be irritating to the skin, and achieve the best possible fit. This particular self-patterning yarn or self-striping yarn made a perfect pair. And that happens based on 2 things, one of which is within your control and one is not. Self-striping yarns are created with very long color repeats. If the manufacturer repeated the colors very accurately, you can get a perfect pair. If not, you can't. You just can't. Nothing you do will help. The second thing you can control, and here I did, that is pulling out yarn when beginning the second sock until you can identify that you are in exactly the same place starting the second sock of the color repeat that you started the first sock. The small ball is what I had to pull out for the second sock to reach that wonderful spot. Don't feel bad about it. This yarn can be later used for doll clothes, and I actually have a whole Barbi wardrobe made out of sock yarns. I'll link you in the program notes. And it can be used for baby socks and even for swatching. Each sock yarn is slightly unique, but they come really close to getting the same gauge if they are #1 sock yarns of the same fiber content.